Okay. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this Together SC legislative update brought to you by the Advocacy Allies Group. My name is Jamie Moon, and I'm the chair of the Advocacy Allies Leadership Team, and we are so glad that you're able to join us today. There's a note in the chat box. Please submit your name and organization to the chat box so we can get a sense of who all is joining us for today. But I do appreciate that you're spending some time with us and look forward to a terrific presentation and terrific discussion following that. So for those of you who may not be as familiar with the Advocacy Allies, the purpose of the Advocacy Allies is for participants to learn together and to address the unique challenges and operating concerns that advocacy organizations face. To also inform and guide Together SC's advocacy efforts on behalf of the sector, to help advance state legislators' understanding of the nonprofit sector and the issues of importance to us, and to engage our philanthropic partners in collaborative agency efforts. And we've made a lot of progress this year. This is our second year. And you're going to hear a little bit more about that in the coming minutes. So again, we cannot be more thrilled to have you. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our facilitator, GP McLeer. GP.
Thanks, Jamie. My name is GP McLeer. I am the Speaking Together coordinator for Together SC. I help manage the Advocacy Allies. I also some of you may know me as the executive director of the South Carolina Arts Alliance, statewide nonprofit focused on arts advocacy, as well as the mayor of the best city in America, Fountain Inn, South Carolina. Thank you all for being here today. I'm wearing my Together SC hat today, so we're going to talk about some of the legislative issues facing the nonprofit sector and at the state and some at the federal level, and some next steps. So I'm going to go ahead and give you a quick rundown of the agenda. Some of you may hopefully have read these, the advocacy principles and the advocacy agenda for Together SC. I'm going to go speed through that pretty quick. It is on Together SC's website. This is a lot of the work that the Advocacy Allies Leadership Team did this summer, along with the Together SC board. And then we published in January. It kind of covers what Together SC advocates for and why we advocate for it. So I think that's important to frame sort of why some of these issues why we're going to talk about some of them today, and some other things that may be on the horizon. We'll go through a very quick slide on setting up the scene of sort of like the landscape of the State House in this new session. And then we're going to turn it over to some of our Advocacy Ally leadership members, Ann Warner and Ashley Lightow from, and I'm sorry, Ashley, I think I just mispronounced your last name wrong, but from the Women's Rights Empowerment Network, and Jamie Moon from Institute of Child Success, and Paige Stevenson from United Way, to talk about some of the issues that are in our advocacy agenda that our members are leading and Together SC is supporting. We'll also talk a little bit about COVID relief and nonprofits. And we'll take some time there to talk about some other issues, and then some advocacy actions that the sector has in front of it. So we will hopefully have time for questions towards the end. That's the goal here. So if you have questions, feel free to throw them in the chat box as they come up, and we'll try to get them answered. But we'll open it up for questions at the end of this presentation to make sure that we're able to get through. There's a lot of really good information in this today. So thank you all for being here again. So Together SC has a document called the Advocacy Principles. The best way to describe this is sort of the filter. It's a filter that we use to determine whether or not Together SC will advocate for something and what level of resources that issue or topic will get from Together SC. So we have 5 advocacy principles. Every issue that we advocate for or put in our advocacy agenda has to fit one or at least one of these 5 areas. Whole sector impact, things that impact the entire nonprofit sector. Specifically, an area that we dedicated to its own principle, the charitable status of nonprofits and any sort of tax implications. That's a specific one that we wanted to make sure we had. Equity and social justice, principle and the democratic processes, anything that impacts a nonprofit ability to participate in democratic process or its employees or its constituents. And then obviously things that impact Together at SC specifically. That's resulted in our 2021-2022 advocacy agenda. We have 3 levels, tiers of support that Together SC will provide to various issues. And we have a monitoring level, which are things that there may not be legislation on yet, or that are really big topics that we're just interested in watching and seeing what happens. Things like redistricting, in general, pandemic response. So that obviously could mean COVID relief specifically, but it could mean things that are happening in education, things that are happening in vaccinations, just kind of keeping a pulse on those things. And also we have a huge list of legislation that we flagged that we kind of keep tabs on, just that are sometimes they're just points of interest for us. Other times they may have the potential to become law. We also have support level advocacy issues that we have, everything on the federal level, which we lean on our National Council of Nonprofits for. We have other things like pay equity, hate crimes legislation, broadband access, childcare access and expansion, things that some of our own Together SC members are leading the charge on that fit some of our 5 principles, and that we think are things that Together SC can lend a voice to. You're going to see 2 examples of that today with the Pay Equity Act and childcare access and expansion. And then lastly, is our lead category. These are things that Together SC is hopefully the face of, or is taking a very large stance in. We dedicate resources to these efforts. COVID relief for nonprofits is the big one this year. And then we also look at nonprofit oversight engagement with state agencies. And we've got a long list of that. All of these are available on the Together SC's website. And you can see those and kind of see the process behind how we do that. Also, we'll be asking you later on in today's agenda, kind of throw some of the things that you are monitoring into the chat box, and those are things that we will look at how we can, how those can be incorporated in. It is a living document, but it was the first step in this is a new sort of advocacy agenda framework that Together SC is using. So be sure you check that out on our website. And I think there's also a big blog post we did when this was released. So setting the scene, sort of why we're here today, to kind of get an update on some of the things facing the sector. So first of all, I want to give you an idea of what the landscape is like at the State House. And that should help you kind of understand where these issues fall into place. So we are, technically we've started the 10th week of the session this week, but last week was the end of the 9th week. We are halfway through the legislative session already in South Carolina for 2021. Things really kicked off though a little bit in November with elections. Every seat in the State House was up for re-election. The vast majority of those ran unopposed or went to incumbents, but we do have 21 new members in the legislature that started in January, 15 in the House and 6 in the Senate. So there are some new faces. The Republican majority in both bodies grew. So that you are seeing some things that are aligned with the GOP platform move faster because of those new numbers, specifically in the Senate, how it impacted their majority there. We also started a new cycle. So the legislature operates on a 2-year cycle. When we have an election like we did in November, where it's almost every seat is up, it's a pretty good marker for a new session, or a new cycle. So any bill that is proposed this year has the potential to become law this year and next year, 2022. And if it doesn't happen by 2022, by May of 2022, and the legislature leaves Columbia, then it has to be refiled again. A great example would be education reform, which was the big issue at the State House over the last 2 years. It had passed the Senate, or it passed the House, and it was working its way through the Senate. And then COVID hit in 2020, and it's died because now it has to be refiled. So we're in the start of that 2-year cycle right now. So anything you see here could be acted on this year, could be acted on next year. Out of the gate, you saw a couple big things happen, and some of this points to the GOP majority that you saw. We saw vaccine support, $208 million to help with vaccine administration and distribution. at the state level, making sure that when we get doses from the federal government, that they get to everywhere we can. You saw the heartbeat bill fly through the legislature and signed into law by the governor, is now on hold by a federal judge. And then teachers also saw their step increases restored. That just finalized, and you'll see and some other education tweaks. Education governance has also been a big topic right now. Right now, halfway through, COVID liability is sort of one of the big ones that we're watching. It is sitting in the House. It passed the Senate. And we don't know where it'll land in the House, how it will fare. It has not gotten its hearing yet. But we're watching that because that will impact nonprofits. We've had a couple of nonprofits reach out already about this, specifically those who are event-based. Those of us in the arts are watching this carefully. Open carry could be debated as early as today on the House floor. It passed judiciary yesterday. The Save Women's Sports Act, I wrote this before yesterday, that was tabled and is pretty much no longer an active bill. But those things were kind of three big hot tamales, as my city HR director likes to say on issues. Three big hot tamales that it took up a lot of oxygen in the room. And we also have the budget process in full swing. The House will begin debating the budget on Tuesday, next week in Columbia. And they will meet and get through the budget. The House will also will be out of town starting March 29th for the week. So you'll probably see the budget pass the House next week. And so that will take up a lot of room on the calendar. And so they see a lot of things moving this week and last week, and all because on April 8th, Thursday, April 8th is the last day that things can cross over from House to Senate or Senate to House. Anything that doesn't make it that far, doesn't get approved by one body by that date, has to stay there until next year. So you're just going to see a lot of things happen. And also federal, we have the American Rescue Plan, which I'm going to talk about later. That is impacting some of the stuff at the State House, or will very soon. So I'm going to turn it over to some of our partners who do advocacy at the state level. I'm going to turn it over to Anne and Ashley at the Women's Rights Empowerment Network, and they're going to talk about the work that they're doing with the Pay Equity Act, which I believe just had a hearing or is about to, one of the two. Anne?
I'm actually going to start. This is Ashley.
Oh, sorry, Ashley, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I'll have you go to the next slide for me. So hi, everyone. My name is Ashley Lido. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Director of Policy and Government Relations for the Women's Rights and Empowerment Network. We're in community with most of the people on the call. I can see participants, lots of our partners, but for anybody who may not be familiar with WREN, our mission is to build a movement for the health, economic well-being, and rights of women and girls in the state of South Carolina. And some of the bills that were previously mentioned that have been hot tamales at the General Assembly, we're active on. So if anything related to gender equity sparked your interest, we are welcome to talk about that in a different setting. So I just want to offer myself as a resource if folks want to have further engagement on any of those issues. For today, we're going to discuss pay equity in South Carolina. I'm going to start with a backgrounder of just kind of the lay of the land, and then I'll go into the bill and pass it over to Anne to talk a little bit more about what everyone can do. So here in South Carolina, we have a gender and racial wealth gap that's very large, and we have a wage gap that contributes to that larger wealth gap. So the wage gap is the difference between how much you're paid, and the wealth gap is how much you actually own. But I'm going to go a little bit further down. It says wealth gap at the top, but I'm going to narrow it down to the wage gap because that's what the Act to Establish Pay Equity will be tackling. So here in South Carolina, Black women make 57 cents for every dollar that a non-Hispanic white man makes. So I emphasize that because that is both the race and gender impacts of what's going on in our state. And we really need to bring that to the forefront. When you put all women together, it's 77 cents for every dollar, men compared to women. But it's really important that we look at how race and gender are impacting the wage and wealth gaps. And it's actually very important when we get to our bill and why we're tackling the policy in the way that we are. South Carolina has one of the widest gaps in the country. It's harmful to not only our families, but our businesses and our communities. And which is why we have so many partners who are with us in this fight. And we know that ensuring people get paid fairly and equitably is one of the crucial ways to help us recover from COVID and have a more resilient workforce. So I'll have you go to the next slide, GP. So some of the current protections, I know some of the people on the phone might be like, but don't we already have some protection? I could go somewhere, EEOC, maybe, question mark. We do have federal laws that cover aspects of pay inequities. The first would be the Equal Pay Act that was passed in 1963, and that said that men and women cannot be paid differently for a business factor. We also have Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, which covers not only sex, but race and age. The ADA also covers disparities for disability. And then in 2009, we had a nice bolstering of the policies with the Lilly Ledbetter Act after a very famous Supreme Court case where Lilly Ledbetter found out way down her career that she had been discriminated against paycheck after paycheck after paycheck. And the courts found that because there's such a tight reporting requirement on the EEOC, that her case wasn't valid because she had missed the time to report the discrimination, but she didn't know that she had been discriminated against because she wasn't able to have that discussion with her coworkers until it was too late. So the Lilly Ledbetter Act made it so that every single paycheck that you receive restarts the clock on discrimination. So if you are discriminated against and find out today, your last paycheck is your time clock for you to go to the EEOC and to file those claims. Here in the state, we have the South Carolina Human Affairs Law that prohibits employment discrimination. So we don't have an explicit equal pay law, but we do have boundaries within the Human Affairs Commission where you could do reporting. It does have limitations because the cap is 15 or more employees within Human Affairs. I will say that both the Human Affairs Commission and the EEOC are woefully underfunded and thus make it very difficult for those who need to seek remedies for pay discrimination to do so. And our Human Affairs Commission typically will take people who have a case in the state and file them through to the federal avenue to the EEOC. So that's just some background. And then I'll have GP go to the next slide. So why do we need legislation? Ashley, you told me there's something there. People can get some remedies. What's going on? So our current law leaves out many people. So South Carolina law, like I mentioned, is only 15 or more employees. So if you're in a small business, you definitely have to go through the federal route. And then the current law has a very broad loophole in the court interpretation of factor other than sex. And we have consulted with South Carolina employment law experts. I'll shout out Melissa Burnett, who is just crucial in helping us understand this issue and what it means for people in the state. That the court has interpreted here in South Carolina, sometimes factor other than sex can even be citing, hey, they're my cousin, so I pay them more. It is not based on business. It was just to identify and point a finger and say it wasn't based on sex. So very big loophole that we need to correct. The retaliation against employees is not explicitly stated. There are safeguards against it, but it does need to be explicitly there for protection. And right now, the policies that are in place are to address after discrimination has occurred, and we need to try to get at the head of before discriminations occur so it doesn't happen. And then if it makes it through that fail guard, then you go to the next step. So we're trying to tackle it before and then potential remedies after, and making that remedy easier for someone who's been discriminated against. So I'll go ahead and have you go to the next slide. Apologies for going fast. It's a lot to put in there. So the Act to Establish Pay Equity, there's a House and a Senate bill, both are bipartisan. The first, it would update the language in the Federal Equal Pay Act to provide clarity. So you know that giant loophole that I described that's factor other than sex? Well, to close and that loophole, we explicitly write out business factor. And we also make sure that we don't have it just based on gender, because we have had conversations with the Human Affairs Commission that confirms what we already know, that discrimination doesn't just happen on the basis of sex or race or disability status. It typically is all actually happening all at once for somebody who lives at the intersections of those identities. So we made sure that our law isn't just about sex. This applies to every person, and you cannot be treated based on your identity differently. It needs to be, your pay needs to be based on skill, effort, responsibility, and the employer has nice safeguards based on our policy of being able to point like, that's a business factor, this is a business factor, and having clarity in any communication is always good. So this is actually something that will benefit employers because they could explicitly outline, this person brought this many years of experience, this many clients to our firm, that's why they get this pay. And that way they're covering themselves because they know the rules, and then the employee also knows that's why they're getting paid that way. It also adds protections to employees and job applicants. It makes sure that it doesn't have any problems with employees disclosing or discussing their wages. So that way you can have an open conversation. I'm a director, you're a director. We've both been working the same amount of time. Here's what I make, having conversation about things. It also ensures that you aren't seeking the wage history. This is what's perpetuating discrimination from job to job. If you were previously making something and being discriminated against in your other job, you shouldn't be carrying that to your new employer. Every job is based on the skill and effort responsibility in that current moment and shouldn't be based on what you were doing in your other place. You're bringing skills to that place, and that's what it should be based on. And then finally, in protections, it's that retaliation. So if you're bringing a claim forward that you feel that you've been discriminated against, that you cannot have retaliation against your employer. It's more about making sure that that mediation process goes smoothly and you're not losing your job just because you raised the claim that there might be discrimination. And we want to increase transparency because when things come to light, that's when you can actually have better conversations with your employees and your employers, and people feel more satisfaction. You give wage ranges to job applicants so that they know if the job is right for them. If you know that a job posting is between $45,000 and $60,000, you as the applicant know whether or not you want to continue in that process. So it actually helps you not waste time. And it helps in negotiations so that you're very clear on if you have the certain skill set and the experience, you can ask for, say, higher in that range. And then it also makes sure that on an annual basis that employers give wage ranges to their employees or upon request. So that way, if you're an current employee, you know the structure within your setting. So that's a lot to cram in all of those things. And Ren is always, always here to go into more detail. We value your partnership. So please just, if we want to talk more about policy, I'm happy to do it offline anytime. And I'm going to kick it over to Anne and have GP go to the next slide to talk about, I have a hidden slide. Not yet, Anne. There are other pay equity bills that we support. I really want to raise up that Senate Bill 533 is moving through the Senate right now. It already passed Senate LCI subcommittee and will be heard by the full. South Carolina still pays people below the minimum wage based on their disability status. This is something that we must end to ensure pay equity in our state. So we very much support this. ABLE-SC is the leading organization on this issue, but we have information on the policy on our REN website if you ever want to know more. And Gilda Cobb-Hunter has an equal pay for equal work law that is more closely aligned with the federal law, but we still actively support any effort that would address pay inequities. So with that, I'll have you go to the next slide and the wonderful Ann Warner.
Thanks, Ashley. I'm Ann Warner. I'm the CEO of REN, and my pronouns are she and her. And what we wanted to do is also give you just a few ideas of how private employers, nonprofit employers, any workplace can take proactive steps to close these huge, stubborn pay gaps that we've had in South Carolina that have barely budged over the years. We advocate for legislation because legislation is a crucial tool to help close those gaps. And it's an essential component to creating a more fair and equitable workplace for everybody. But there's a lot that employers and all of us can actually go ahead and do without public policy reform. So first of all, understanding if you actually have some pay gaps that need to be resolved. you're only going to know if you do that by doing some kind of a pay equity audit. And these can range, they can be very simple, they can be very complex, and depends on your workplace and how many employees you have and what all the different job levels and classifications that you have. But just looking at your similar job functions, jobs that require equivalent skill level and responsibility, and organizing those by employee, looking at job-related factors such as how long an employee has been there, what kind of training, education they have, what kind of output that they're making as an employee in terms of their contributions to the work. Any of those could be justifiable differentiators of a difference in pay. But you also need to look at demographic data, such as gender, age, and race, because these would not be justifiable differentiators for differences in pay. So it's really important to try and put that into one place and look more objectively at where and how you're paying people and how those differ. And if there are discrepancies that are not explainable by business-related factors, looking at what are some of the operational issues that could have led to those unjustified pay gaps. It's rare that somebody is, actively trying to discriminate against a particular group. But it is very common that unclear or unfair systems or implicit or unconscious bias can show up and perpetuate these kinds of pay gaps. Also, some things that you can do that are pretty easy. First of all, stop asking for salary history when recruiting and hiring job candidates. As Ashley said, that is one of the biggest ways that unjustifiable pay gaps are perpetuated. So please stop doing that. And most of you probably have stopped doing that. When I started out my career, I thought that's just what you did. It took me a while to realize that, how problematic that practice is. Start, if you're not, including wage and salary ranges in all job postings. As Ashley said, that helps create clarity, transparency, and we have found at Wren that it also saves a lot of time if you can start that expectation from the beginning. And developing clear and transparent pay structures that explain how compensation and promotion decisions are made. This is something Wren has done within the last 6 months to help, again, create the clarity that is needed for our workforce to explain pay levels, structures, and how that works and how decisions are made. Again, back to these operational discrepancies, unconscious bias and interview training for leadership and HR professionals is a really good way to start to root out some of the factors that may be contributing to pay gaps in your workplace. I'm gonna ask you to move on. Thanks, GP. Okay, so what can you do to help support the legislation in the House and Senate? Bipartisan legislation in both chambers. We have a pay equity letter of support that we will circulate after this call. Many of you have already signed on in support of this, representing your organization, and we would like to invite all of you to do so. This will be used next week. Next week is Equal Pay Day /week. March 24th is Equal Pay Day, which is the day into the year that the average woman would have had to work to make what the average man worked the previous 12 months. So in other words, the average woman has to work an additional 3 months to earn, or 15 months to earn what a man would make in 12 months. So Equal Pay Day, March 24th, we'll be having a campaign next week and a couple of events we'd love to invite you to. A conversation with an employment attorney on Tuesday on Facebook Live, that'll be at noon. And then a conversation with our lead sponsor in the House, Representative Wendy Brawley, who will talk more about the legislation and what the status is, what the prospects are, and why we need to keep that moving. Wren also has a bigger resource on how to address gender equity in the workplace and a brand spanking new 2-page pay equity brief. They'll be up on our website, and we will also circulate those to y'all after this call. And I think there's one last slide. Wren has a very robust legislative agenda. pay equity is one of our high priority bills, but there are quite a few others. So we invite you to join our network if you're not part of it. Follow our legislative agenda, which we keep updated on our website, and follow us on social media, which is updated these days multiple times a day with the progress of the bills that we are tracking and following. So that's it. Hopefully we'll have a chance to answer any questions later on. Over to Paige and Jane.
Thanks, Amy and Ashley. Yeah, I'm just gonna throw it over to Paige and Jamie, and I'm not sure who's going first, so I'll let y'all take it.
I think Paige is going to take the first part.
Yes. Good morning. Well, actually now it's afternoon. So good afternoon. I'm Paige Stevenson. I'm President and CEO of United Way of the Piedmont. We serve Spartanburg, Cherokee, and Union counties. And as a network, United Ways, all 25 of us work together as it comes to policy. And so just looking at some of the things that are coming up right now around statewide 4K access. Governor McMaster's 21-22 executive budget actually included an additional $48 million for statewide expansion for full day 4K, but specifically for at-risk children. And at-risk children are defined as those who would receive free or reduced lunch. To know that a few years back, the legislature actually made publicly funded 4K available for these children, but only if they met two criteria. One was the free and reduced lunch, but they also had to live in the state's poorest school districts. So if you happen to be a child that would qualify for free and reduced lunch, but your school district was not one of the poorest, you did not have that opportunity. So you were being penalized. And so this budget would address that. This year's proposal by the governor would basically make this available to all. So the challenge is, though, it is not being included in the first House Ways and Means Committee budget. And so what we are seeing right now is that, and this is not uncommon, the first go around with the budget when it goes through the House, they tend to be a little more conservative with things. And since there is not recurring revenue being shown to be available, House Ways and Means Chair Merle Smith is putting a pin in it to make sure that we do have that recurring revenue, and then making that a priority later this year. But there are also two other priorities as it relates to that recurring funding, and that is state employee pay, and then the additional DSS funding that is needed to make sure that we're in compliance with that lawsuit. Now, the Board of Economic Advisors will actually be releasing updated fiscal forecasts next month on the 15th. And that's when they'll find out, the legislature will find out if there's more funding available for 4K expansion. Actually, the House is going to begin debating the budget next week. And so that usually takes about a week or so, and then they'll be sending that over to the Senate. So that gives you just that high level look at that 4K expansion. And now I'll kick it to Jamie so he can talk to you about increased childcare supports.
Yes, thank you so much, Paige. And so I'm playing two roles here. You know, I'm the Advocacy Allies Leadership Team Chair, but I'm also the President and CEO of the Institute for Child Success. But let me go back, and I should have done this at the outset, and I apologize. I'd like to say a special thank you to members of the Advocacy Allies Leadership Team. This is a new sort of subgroup within Together SC, And this group has really worked hard over the last several years to get to the point that we're at. So I just want to recognize those folks. These are the members of the Advocacy Allies Leadership Team. Amber Brown, she's with the Coastal Community Foundation of South Carolina. Nancy Lee, Nancy is with the South Carolina Association of Habitat for Humanity. Also Bernie Mazik, who's the CEO of the South Carolina Association for Community Economic Development. China Phillips with the Sisters of Charity Foundation. Amy Splitgerber, who is with Healthy Learners. Paige Stevenson, who you just spoke, and John Tynan with Conservation Voters of South Carolina. And then Ann Warner, who just spoke a little while ago with REN. And also GP, who is our facilitator. So I just wanted to give a special shout out to my fellow members of the leadership team. Now, switching gears back toward childcare supports. And we included this. This isn't really South Carolina policy, but what happened with the what happened with the recent American Rescue Plan Act is going to have a major impact on the child care landscape in South Carolina. So we wanted to mention it. There's a significant amount of money that's going to be coming to South Carolina to help parents and child care providers as a result of that recently passed act by Congress. So to begin with, we're going to see an increase in the child tax credit from $2,000 to $3,000, which is huge. And there's also going to be an additional $600 supplement for children 5 years and young and under. And I can't, this is extraordinarily significant. It will certainly help those families with very young children. It also includes the act altogether includes an additional $15 billion an allocation for child development block grants. So South Carolina voucher, we think, will get about $275 million of that overall $15 billion allocation. And then there's an additional, and this is nationwide, $1 billion for the Head Start early education programs. Now, I'm not at this point certain, and maybe someone else on the call is, how much of that $1 billion will come to South Carolina Head Starts, but that's, again, a significant amount of money. Further, this act includes a $24 billion stabilization fund for child care providers, which we expect that South Carolina is going to get an additional $440 million in direct supports for child care centers. So if you combine that with the South Carolina voucher money, we're estimating, over $700 million that is coming to the state of South Carolina for child care. And this last point is really critical because if you follow this, like certainly we have at the Institute for Child Success, you'll know that child care centers in particular have been very hit hard by the pandemic. We've done some surveys and found that centers have lost an average of $100,000 since the beginning of the pandemic, and these are small businesses that operate on extraordinarily thin margins, even in the best of times. So this funding is going to be critical for them. Further, some of the things that are available to a lot of small businesses, such as the PPP, we know that child care centers across the state of South Carolina had difficulty accessing the PPP funds. And in some instances weren't able to last year. So this stabilization money is going to be extraordinarily important for them. Now, this isn't recurring money. And the Department of Social Services, Director Leach, they're very aware of that. I happened to speak with Director Leach. He actually spoke with my ICS Board of Directors Executive Committee, the officers, on Monday. And so they know that they're going to need to deploy this money, and they're going to need to do it by a specific date. I know that the department is undertaking, they've surveyed childcare centers to find out how and what's best for the use of the funding. And so, but he's very aware of that. And some of us on this call, Institute for Child Success, the United Way, and others will be working closely to be able to, offer whatever help we can give to DSS as they make decisions about how to deploy that money. The childcare industry, just let me close by saying the childcare industry is extraordinarily important for obvious reasons, for this health, safety, well-being of the children, but it's also an important economic factor in getting South Carolina back to work and making certain that we have a thriving economy. So very thrilled with this ACT money that's coming through, and maybe it'd be wonderful if we could get it to be recurring at some point in the near future. So with that, those are my comments. GP, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thanks, Jamie, Paige, Ann, and Ashley. Just for everyone on the call to kind of get an idea of why we highlighted these two issues and why these two issues are in the advocacy agenda for Together SC for this year. Not only for pay equity, not only does it go towards our advocacy principle of our equity and social justice principle, but also it impacts how nonprofits operate as employers. And so it also impacts the entire sector. Additionally, with childcare access, not only does it impact, well, the main one actually is whole sector impact, because nonprofit employees rely on childcare as well, and that's a big factor in how nonprofits are successful in being employers, how the environment they provide for their workforce. So those are how those things kind of hit the principles of the Together SC agenda. And so I wanted to make sure you kind of understood that angle. So the last piece that I want to talk about today is kind of, I think, a biggest one for everyone here is COVID relief for nonprofits. This is the biggest issue that Together SC is taking the lead on. And we wanted to highlight the status of that and give you guys some insights, as well as wrap up with some additional things that are going on at the state and federal level that we want to bring to your attention. First off, the first time we saw COVID relief targeted for nonprofits in the state of South Carolina, for all nonprofits in general, was for the CARES Act, the second allocation of CARES Act funding from the State House that was appropriated in September of 2020. Had $25 million for nonprofits that identified, I think it was 6 or 7 priority areas, service areas. All of that money was spent. Over 1,500, almost 1,600 applications were submitted, 686 grants awarded. We learned some lessons through that process. Together SC was really busy during that time in making sure that that pot of money even existed to begin with, but then B, helping nonprofits navigate the process, having the Department of Administration talk to nonprofits directly, and then after the fact, combing through the data and coming up with what are the additional needs. So we have, I would say, 3 key lessons that inform the work that I'm going to talk about going forward. One, disqualification based on local funding. The CARES Act, as a federal law, had some pretty straightforward strings attached of not being able to essentially double count expenses or get multiple sources of funding from CARES Act for entities. That took a hit to one county in particular in Greenville County, who was the only county to get CARES Act funding directly from the feds because of their population. And so that impacted sort of how those grants were administered in that county. Additionally, the grant rubrics used for the CARES Act, we saw areas where there wasn't clarity to nonprofits, or also that the Department of Admin just had trouble getting the right material from nonprofits. And then the administration of the grant is key. Madeline in particular has done a great job working with the Department of Admin, especially after the fact, to kind of understand the data and the process so that we could all sort of have some takeaways from that, because we knew that the CARES Act wasn't going to be the only time that this sort of situation arose, and we're kind of at that moment. Before the American Rescue Plan, which is sort of the biggest piece that I'm going to talk about, came to fruition, we already identified a state strategy when it came to further COVID relief during this session. One, that any sort of statewide relief should include nonprofits. The governor proposed $123 million for small business relief in his executive budget, but did not explicitly include nonprofits as eligible. And the intent that we heard was that nonprofits actually weren't a part of that pot. So the governor's proposal is just a proposal. It's not even the basis of which the House takes, it's not a framework that they necessarily use. But our first strategy is that any relief should include nonprofits. That's the that's the bar to start with. Additionally, making sure that there's a nonprofit perspective on the grant making process, we think is important. There are a lot of agencies, and I know I saw one or two of them on the call who do have experience in granting to nonprofits and can provide that insight. There are other agencies within the state that don't do this all the time. And so making sure that there's a nonprofit perspective in the grant making process is important. And then ideally, one of the things we would love to see is standalone nonprofit support and managing that. We're going to use the data from the CARES and also the Together SC nonprofit survey, which I've got a special note on in a second, using that data to help inform any sort of requests and things like that. So the big thing that happened was the American Rescue Plan, in particular, public funding. So there are some other pots. Jamie talked about funding for childcare. There's funding for some broadband expansion. There's funding for a lot of different things. For wearing my arts at National Endowment for the Arts has some money that trickles down to the states. But for all nonprofits as businesses, Together SC's identified the public funding portion of the ARP as something to really pay attention to as we move forward and understand and have a voice in. The American Rescue Plan sends money to states, counties, and cities. So a little over $2 billion is estimated to come to the state. So much like the CARES Act, they had a little over $1 billion. Much like the CARES Act, there's $2 billion coming to the state of South Carolina. Additionally, though, the difference is last time only one county in the state had other funding. Now every county will also have funding from the state, from the federal government. So all 46 counties will have funding directly from the Treasury Department. And in addition to that, every city in the state will have funding from the federal government through the ARP. Every town, every city, there's I think 270 municipalities in the state. Every single one of them will get funding for this. So and the eligible uses are key here. So for public health, obviously, administering public health needs, negative economic impact, addressing those, that includes relief to households, businesses, and nonprofits. That is sort of the big bucket that we're looking at, the big eligible use at least. Local governments can also use it to have premium pay for their essential workers. Also, local government lost revenue, such as hospitality accommodations tax, and also investments in water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure. So there are a lot of eligible uses. This is a lot more flexible than the CARES Act was, and you can use the money through 2024. So there's a lot of moving parts to this, but as we saw before, CARES Act is where nonprofits saw COVID relief in the state. Nonprofits are again allowed to have that same type of relief through the ARP at every level of government. So that sort of presents its own set of challenges. This is a little bit, hold on, make sure, yeah. So I no, go the other way. There we go. I want to talk a little bit more about this then. We're going to do a deep dive on this in the coming weeks, so be on the lookout for this. This is not the end all be all of information on this by any means. The Municipal Association, the National Association of Counties, and others are waiting on advisement from the Department of Treasury on what the regulations exactly are related to this funding, and that will help fine-tune advocacy approaches. But we see the need for advocacy at every level. Together SC will focus most of its efforts at the state level to make sure that some of those lessons we learned from the CARES Act are implemented, especially making sure that nonprofits have access to funds at every level of their government and aren't disqualified because they've got something from one pot but not another pot, and sort of advising on how that might work. So stay tuned for a lot more information on that. But we think this is where the majority of the COVID relief funding will come from, particularly because I talked about the governor's proposal for small businesses. The House Ways and Means chair, though, in their budget hearing said, that's not in the current proposal of the budget. But there's a reason. They are waiting on the federal dollars to create any sort of COVID relief funding. So now that we have that approved, that's the name of the game. It will most likely follow a similar process that the CARES Act did. The CARES Act had ad hoc committees at the House and Senate level and flowed that way. Most likely it will do that way. I wanted to put a note, this was a note to myself, and I meant to put on a different slide, apologies, but if you have other legislative issues, by the way, that your organization's focusing on, before I forget, throw those in the chat. We're going to download those and do some action around those too at some point. But I needed to throw that out there as an aside. I just accidentally put it in the wrong place. My apologies. So again, there are some advocacy priorities related to this ARP funding that we're focusing on. Biggest one for Together C is state legislative language. What does that bill actually look like, and what does it say, and what are the nonprofits eligibility requirements? What is our voice in the process? We're going to be looking at that. Additionally, we're going to be helping at least disseminate to members of Together SC any sort of guidance that's given to local governments. We've seen some from the Municipal Association already, but again, they're waiting on full guidance from Treasury before there's any actual, hey, cities, you can do this with your money, or you should do this with your money. We want to make sure that they can allow multiple funding sources in an ideal situation. And also the administration of grants and transparency throughout the process. We do see the fact that all of these local governments are getting access to funds, some of which are pretty big. They can exceed 75% of their annual budget, the total amount they can get. But some of them are going to get about 50% or more of what they normally get in a year. They're going to get it one time. So these local governments are going to have to wrestle with some pretty big numbers and make sure that they do it in a transparent way. And so there's a lot to sort of manage in that. So those are our priorities when it comes to how those public funds for local governments and state government get appropriated across the state. There's local advocacy that we're going to encourage members to partake in. Municipal Association of Counties are going to distribute guidance, like I said. There's lots of flexibility on spending. It's important for Together SC members to have contact with their local officials as soon as possible. I will tell you, as the local elected official, like those, even though we're not going to get the money for about 30 to 45, maybe 60 days, there's a lot of thinking that's going into what can we do with this money and how do we do it appropriately and responsibly. You can also consider long-term strategies. Some of this funding doesn't have to be spent until 2024. So there's a lot of moving parts to this, and it's important that nonprofits work with their local governments and get to know them if you don't already, or work with them. And we also have found power in a collective voice. If you can work with your collective voice, your collective nonprofits in your county, for instance, that has proven to work well and kind of raises your profile up. We're going to have some more on this as we go forward. I believe we're waiting on the National Council of Nonprofits to put together a national webinar on this, as well as we'll be doing a deep dive on this once more guidance is given. We've invited the Municipal Association to help with that as well. So be on the lookout for a lot more information on that piece in particular. I mentioned the nonprofit survey. This was sent out to all Together SC members. Over 900 responses to our 2021 survey were received. We're crunching the data right now. That's a really good number compared to where we were last year. We had a really good response rate. I believe it was 24%, if I'm not mistaken. So really good response rate on that survey. Covers topics such as revenue loss, staff changes, operation adjustments, and more. We're going to be using this data for advocacy at all levels. It's really important, and it's coming at the perfect moment in time. So we thank you for those of you who participated in that survey, who filled it out. Even if you didn't, just know that this is out there. This will help every nonprofit's case as we look to make sure that nonprofit needs are addressed in the wake of COVID-19, for you to either meet the increased demand that you've experienced or help relieve some of the loss you have experienced, where nonprofits are experiencing it on both ends in dramatic ways. There are a couple other items I wanted to make sure I highlighted. Some because they saw recent action, the hate crimes legislation that is on Together SC's advocacy agenda under our support passed committee yesterday. And it heads to the House floor for debate. We'll be looking to connect everybody with additional partners who are leading that and have them do a breakdown of what that means for the state of South Carolina, most likely through a blog, maybe through a webinar, but that's coming as well. There's a couple other things at the federal level that I want to bring nonprofits' attention to. Senator Tim Scott helped introduce a bill for extending the charitable tax deduction and increasing it in the CARES Act. If you filed your taxes already, you knew that even if you didn't itemize, if you take the standard deduction, you were able to claim up to $300 of charitable deductions if you donated that last year. That is pretty much the first iteration of a universal charitable tax deduction that the nonprofit sector has been pushing for, so that every American citizen has the benefit of a tax write-off when they donate to their community. Senator Scott increases that to a third of the standard deduction maximum. It's about $4,000 for single filers, $8,000 for joint filers for the year 2021 and 2022. That's a great win for the nonprofit sector right now. We'd love to see that be extended beyond instead of just being a response to COVID, but in permanent language, but this is a step in the right direction. You're also going to see delays in redistricting. The census data will not be made available until around September. And so this impacts, this is a big piece of what we're monitoring at the state and federal level for Together SC is the impact redistricting and the census data itself has on federal appropriations, representation at local, state, and federal levels, and a lot more. It is going to be a pretty important topic to follow. Additionally, something new that came across our desk today, the House passed a bill to extend the window to apply for PPP, which technically closes March 31st, to extend it to May 31st. We're already seeing some banks stop accepting applications because they can't turn it around in time. So that is in the works, and I believe there's actually a hearing on it today at 2:30 in DC. And then lastly, there are a couple other things in the ARP I already talked about state and local. It added $7.25 billion to PPP. It increased unemployment maintained unemployment, to 300 a week on top of your state. And also created a good win for larger nonprofits that haven't been eligible for PPP. If you have more than 500 employees, you're eligible for PPP as long as it is under 500 employees per site, essentially, per chapter. You can now apply. There's more at the link in the slide, which will be emailed to you. The Council of Nonprofits is sort of where we get our lead from on a lot of these federal issues. Lastly, these are some advocacy actions that you all can take above and beyond what Jamie, Paige, Ann, and Ashley talked about. Look for the reviews on how ARP can be used in your county, in your city. This is going to be a topic of conversation. For instance, I would encourage your local governments to make sure that they pass actual legislation, whether it's a resolution or an ordinance that states how they intend on spending this money, so that you know where it's going and that you have the ability to ask questions. That's what we're going to be doing in Fountain Inn. And we want transparency. There'll also be a sign-on letter as we get towards the state getting their ARP money, of making sure that nonprofit voices are heard. So be on the lookout for a sign-on letter from Together SC. Be sure you contact local leaders. Like I said, be a team approach has helped. Together SC led a great team to make sure that the nonprofits were included in the CARES Act. Be sure to replicate that locally. And then also start time to reach out to legislators. Your House members are actually off the week of March 29th. They will be home. So if you see them, talk to them about this. This will be front of mind, especially when they return and the money starts getting into the state's bank account. So be sure that you are in contact with your legislators. And with that, I'm right on time. That's my email in case you want to reach out to me. I know there were a couple questions. Madeline, I don't know, you were kind of reading and I saw chiming in, and I don't know if you've answered most of them or not, but did you see anything you needed to add or address?
Thanks, GP, and thanks everyone. Great presentation, lots of good information. I know it was coming at you fast. It's hard when we're on these Zoom calls. We will send out the recording. We will send out the slides. We'll make sure that follow-up email summarizes some of these next steps so they're right in front of you in the next day or two. Alice had asked, how did Together SC put together this advocacy agenda? And Jamie and GP touched on it lightly, but I want to just close by sharing my thoughts on this. I've been with Together SC 10 years this spring, and at last we are where we need to be with our advocacy efforts. And it is because of the strategic direction that our board took that said, let's work with the people who know advocacy best. And putting together this leadership team of our advocacy allies with Ann and Jamie and GP, who's now moved from being part of the volunteer team to being our consultant. And Timberlake, who worked with us last year, retired. And as you can see, GP is taking the bull by the horns and doing fantastic work, which is, we would expect no less of a nonprofit leader turned businessman. So what we were able to do with the leadership team's guidance and the advocacy committee that Paige chaired at the board was to move our agenda from being solely focused on administrative issues to looking at the broader issues that affect the way the nonprofit sector as a whole operates. And in addition, we moved from just things that we would monitor and work on to things that we would support. And hence, that support section of our agenda is so key. And the reason for this call and our commitment to you to say, if you have an issue that you think other nonprofits would be effective allies for, if you're taking the lead on something, they can come in with a letter of support and help advocate together. Let us help you make those connections through sessions like this, through sharing links to your websites. That's why GP's request that you share in the chat box what you're working on and a link to your advocacy agenda so we can give you shout outs and help you get connected with the partners you need to advance that work. So I think those two additions of tackling things like the census and COVID relief and broader issues and doing more to support your individual advocacy efforts by encouraging collaboration are huge steps forward in our advocacy efforts. And I hope that you will see great benefits from that work. So with that, I should close this out. I see a few people sharing in the chat box, but if you don't get the chance to share in the chat box, email GP or me directly. But again, Advocacy Allies, leadership team members, board members that are on this call, GP, I love watching you guys in action. This is great work that you're doing, and we stand ready to support all of you. So with that, go change the world. Have a great day.